Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar from our daily meditations from Mirror of Intimacy, daily reflections on emotional and erotic intelligence. I'm Alex Katehakis, and today is September 14th, 2015. So welcome to all of you that are attending today, and we're going to be talking about recovery. I want to remind you that I welcome all questions, concerns, comments. You can always type a note to me so we can chat directly, and typically I reread your notes or your questions, and then I try my best to answer them. Also, if you are struggling with any issues around sex and sexuality, sex or love addiction, and you want to speak to an intake counselor, our intake counselors are available right now to take your phone calls, and they can be reached at the number on the slide, which is 310-843-9902. Keep in mind that we're in Los Angeles, so we are on the West Coast, depending on where you are and time and all of that. We have many, many programs and resources that we can offer you, so feel free to call and ask questions anytime. All right, so why don't we get started with the quote of the day, which is from Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she says, "Pity me that the heart is slow to learn what the swift mind beholds at every turn." And I think this is a very sweet statement that she's making, that the heart is slow to learn oftentimes because we register things in our bodies very quickly, so much more quickly than we do in our minds, because the mind actually interprets so much data that's coming in, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the associations that we make to the past, and then it goes through this sort of wild, elaborate system and circuitry before the left brain starts to make meaning about it. And oftentimes it will make meaning and fill in the gaps that are not accurate. So even though the mind is swift and can make very quick inferences about things, it is not always accurate. What is accurate is the heart, and unfortunately the heart is much slower. The visceral system, on the one hand, is rapid because we feel things quickly, and on the other hand, it's slower for us to make the discernment sometimes about what our body is actually saying to us because of the tendency to fill in the blanks so swiftly. So I think recovery then in this context is about really taking time with ourselves, being compassionate, and recognizing that we don't have to have the answer about everything in a swift moment, that it can take us a while before we start to figure things out in a way that's accurate for each one of us. So when I think about sobriety and I think about recovery, I think of two different notions, and people use those terms interchangeably, but they are different. So any kind of sobriety, in this case sexual sobriety, means the cessation of acting out unhealthy sexual behaviors. And again, you get to determine what those unhealthy behaviors are, not me, not some other therapist, not a magazine. But if you're engaging in something that feels particularly problematic to you, destructive, hurtful, abusive to yourself or somebody else, then we consider that those are, quote, unhealthy sexual behaviors. And being sober from those behaviors is what constitutes a form of emotional sobriety, actually. And recovery, on the other hand, means recapturing one's sexual health. So in this line of thinking, you have to be sexually sober first. You've got to stop engaging in behaviors that are secretive, shaming, abusive to yourself or someone else before you can start to recover a sense of your sexuality. And excuse me, what we find here quite often at Center for Healthy Sex is that sometimes people who have these sexual problems, sexual addiction or compulsivity, don't are not really recovering something that they had previously because they never had it to begin with. And as I've talked about many times now on this series, when people are, injured sexually, very young, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, humiliation, shame, certainly bullying, oftentimes their sexuality is shame-based from very early to such an extent that they're not actually recovering a sexuality. They're learning about a sexuality for the first time. So just in the interest of semantics, I want to make that clear. But for the purposes of this talk, we are talking about restoration of something that was either previously there and broken or was never fully experienced in a healthy way to begin with. So again, I want to remind you to please chime in at any time if you have questions or something you want me to address in this talk about this topic. The definition of recovery that I'm talking about assumes that we're all naturally born with sexual health, and that is impacted by genetic predispositions or physiological conditions, and psychic trauma can further damage that too. So let's assume that we're all born perfect. And when you see infants, newborn infants, you see that there is a perfection there. There's an innocence. There's an unbelievable tenderness to the extent that we cannot survive without caregivers in our infancy. So it's true that we are born perfectly beautiful, whole, pure, innocent, and all of those things. Now, that said, we could have a genetic anomaly or a congenital problem that we're born with, and also some of us are more wired towards being high desire sexually, some more low desire sexually, but these are things that are sort of natural, to what our physiology is bringing in. And so we want to have compassion again for these predispositions, and also any kind of psychic trauma that sits on top of our natural predispositions is going to hamper us sexually one way or the other. There are many people who have the experience of growing up in a household where, they're criticized quite a bit for how they sit, how they speak, that their grades aren't good enough, that they're somehow not doing it right at all times. And that creates a profound level of shame, which resides deep in the body, deep in the gut. And that shame can start to wrap around a person so that they feel that they are shameful on all levels. They feel ashamed about how they look, how they walk, the sound of their voice, that their sexuality is dirty, bad, wrong. And so this kind of trauma, this psychic trauma that starts to envelop and swaddle a person's sexuality doesn't have to come from a sexual trauma. It can just come from that kind of egregious, chronic emotional abuse and criticism. So when we ask the question, what is your sexual health, I want you to imagine how you might function in your sexual and relational and emotional prime. What would sexual health mean to you? Do you have any ideas of that? And if so, are these ideas that you would like to share or talk about right now? So if you had your perfect sexual scenario and you were operating optimally, what would that look like for you? And does it have to do with your shame or psychological barriers that you have to sex? Or does it have to do with some physical illness? Or does it have to do with your aging body or your changing body? Somebody here wrote lack of shame in body image. So I'd like to know more of what you mean by that. If you don't have shame in your body image, then that is certainly a plus, and that would stand to reason that you would have much less shame about being sexual and having sex also, because oftentimes people limit themselves because of their ideas of what they think their body should look like. So if you wouldn't mind writing a little bit more of that, that would be helpful to learn. Some people reading this reflection, as I said earlier, are in recovery for sex addiction or for love addiction also. Some people might be in recovery from drugs and alcohol, but the use of drugs and alcohol over time have impeded their ideas about sex and sexuality or made them feel shameful. And people can be in recovery from all sorts of things because of the nature of the addictive and compulsive culture that we live in, which is always selling to us that if we have more of something or get more, then we will likely be happier. And if we don't have those things, we can feel unworthy and like we're not going to get the sexual partner that we want. So here, the woman that wrote to me said, lack of shame in body image. A healthy body image contributes to a sense of confidence and therefore a lack of fear in their approach to exploring sexuality. And I think that that's accurate. When you lack shame, that would mean that you have a healthier sense of yourself. Then you're going to be more confident, less afraid of exploring your sexuality. So it's really the unlocking of shame, which often accompanies sexual addiction and sexual compulsivity, and starts to open the portal and the way towards recovering one's sexuality that is essential for this kind of sexual recovery. And even if you're not a sex addict, but you were sexually abused or covertly sexually abused as a teen or a child, it's likely you're going to have shame around your body and sexuality. So this notion of covert shaming or sexualizing or covert incest is an important one because a child can grow up with a parent who never lays a hand on them, never touches them sexually, but the implications are there when the mother says something to her young son, a 10-year-old boy, about what a hot body he has, or a father starts to comment on his daughter's developing breasts or her figure in ways that are inappropriate. That can feel dirty and like an impingement on the child because it's an age-inappropriate comment being made, and it's coming from a parent. So that can have somebody covering up their body or feeling like there's something wrong with their body. So one person's recovery is not everyone's recovery. This is not a one-size-fits-all situation, and we don't have to be addicts ourselves to recover from these toxic views, beliefs, or any kind of message that doesn't serve us. So think about any messages that you've had along the way, whether it was from a teacher or a parent or a sibling about sex and sexuality, and ways that maybe it has created beliefs in you that aren't even yours. Things that you've carried with you for a long time that are sort of like wearing a garment that doesn't fit anymore. So if you were to design your perfect sexual experience and sexual health for yourself, what are the toxic views, messages, and beliefs you would have to discard in order to have that perfect view? So we also have, the matter of the culture of our family, how we grow up, and the messages we get, and then cultural overlays on top of that. Someone writes, my mother has a sense of body shame and I do not, which is pretty remarkable that wasn't transmitted over time. This has been a source of conflict between us because she disapproves of the way I dress. I'm proud of my body and I dress in ways that make me feel proud and pretty, but these things are too revealing for her and they cause her disapproval. So I think that, this can be a generational gap. This can be a cultural gap. And then you also have to consider if you're not living at home and you're not, under 18 anymore, how do you bridge that gap between what your mother thinks you should be doing and what you know is right for you in ways that aren't antagonistic for her if you want to preserve a relationship with her? So that doesn't mean when you go to visit her, you're all covered up and you, dress like a nun. Nor does it mean when you go to visit her that you are dressed in a way that's highly triggering and provocative for her either, in a way that you might be dressing to go to a club or a party or to the beach even. Can you find a middle ground for tending to yourself and not violating your mother's sense of composure, or worse yet, her repression, so that the conversation you have with her and the experience you have with her is actually about the relationship between the two of you and not a power struggle about what you're wearing? Someone else says, is true recovery completely possible, or is this a lifelong struggle? Meaning, through working on this, can I get to a point where all trauma and sexual problems are in the past? That's a very big question. I think that recovery is, rather than thinking about it as a lifelong struggle, I would encourage you to think about it as a lifelong path of self-awareness. And I think everybody has this that's awake, that's on some path of, let's say, self-improvement or self-awareness. You know, many people get into therapy that aren't addicts. They get into therapy for all sorts of life challenges and struggles. And if they stay in therapy over time, they are on a path of self-awareness and self-exploration. And I think to truly be generative in the way that Maslow talked about it, this is a lifelong commitment and endeavor. Because as you start to reveal yourself to yourself, you start to recognize that who you were as a child is not who you were as a teen, and who you are in your 20s is not who you were as a teen, and who you are in your 30s and 40s changes. So we actually have the luxury and the privilege of redefining ourselves and getting to know ourselves with each subsequent decade. And if you are awake to this process, it can be painful, but it can also bring unbelievable, amounts of joy and an experience of the extraordinary in life, as opposed to those who are never forced to embark on a path of self-awareness, who are still wearing the same clothes in their 40s they were wearing in their 20s, and spouting the same ideologies, and worse yet, are still doing it in their 60s. And we've all known people like that, and they're not that interesting to be around, because their sense of self and their exploration of self has become quite narrow. And so this process of recovery is expansive. It's a deconstructing process where you're pulling everything apart and looking at everything and examining what parts of myself do I want to keep, what parts of my family of origin do I want to keep, what are the values that I got and the lessons I got from my parents that are actually quite useful, and which messages are toxic and not useful that I want to discard and get rid of. So I think true recovery is possible, but I believe it's a day-to-day proposition. I don't think you have true recovery and then, you're finished and you go back to sleep and life is, whatever, a cabaret or whatever the number of sayings are, a bowl of cherries. I think it's all of those things. And I think at some point now to be more honoring of the question that you're asking, I do think when you do enough psychotherapeutic work and you're doing good work with somebody and really excavating the trauma, especially in the body, at some point these traumas are diminished and they're in your rearview mirror. And you may always be challenged or struggled by challenged or triggered by something, but you just notice it now and you know that it's part of the fabric and the landscape of who you are. You don't try to get rid of it. It's also not running the show. It's just another scar. It's part of who you are, and you embrace it and you take it with you. But over time, these traumas should definitely soften and they should recede. So someone says, I always try to dress in ways, we're back to the conversation we were having about dressing, ways that are appropriate to the situation, because she writes that she's over 40. For example, I wouldn't wear anything revealing to a funeral, whether it makes me feel pretty or not, which is respectful because it's inappropriate for sexy attire. Though I don't dress for a funeral type of situation, I do try to accommodate the cultural difference between LA and my hometown, which is in Canada as well when I visit my mother. So yes, I think that is an adult thing to do. LA certainly has a particular culture. We have a certain kind of weather, namely it's been unbelievably hot for weeks on end now. So when it's hot, we wear clothes that are more revealing, less fabric, sheer fabric. It feels good, it feels comfortable, and it's appropriate. So you want to make sure that you're just doing what's appropriate for the situation you're in, and honoring your body. And there are ways to honor your body when it's cold outside also. So just take care that it's all context related. And somebody, makes a point that when we get it to a point where trauma is at the past, we also want to recognize that childhood trauma never fully goes away. Even in old age, researchers have found that childhood trauma can be instantly recalled, so that it doesn't mean that we're erasing traumatic memories. There are some research, where there are medications that are being used for highly egregious traumas in search of finding ways to eradicate memories altogether. And I think if you are a victim of, some horrible trauma, then certainly you may never want to remember those things again. But we always remember our traumas, but our stories change over time as we remember them, and our relationship to them changes over time too. So again, we don't want to eradicate parts of our personality. We want to integrate and fold them into who we are. Melissa writes, after 33 years of marriage, my husband, who had 2 sexual encounters, he says he's not a sex addict. I know he had several sexual partners before we were married. Would you say he's a sex addict? And I would say to you that there's no possible way for me to know that, not having met him and gotten an extensive sexual history from him. I do think there's a difference between bona fide sex addiction and people who cheat. And if somebody's reporting that they've had 2 affairs during the course of a 33-year marriage, and that is in fact the truth, I would not call that person a sex addict. If, however, they're minimizing and lying about that, and in effect they've had several 50, 100, hundreds of sexual encounters during that 33 years, I would say they were more likely to be a sex addict. And this is why assessment by a sex addiction professional is really necessary, so that we don't bandy that term about every time somebody has an affair or watches internet pornography or goes and has a sexual massage. Those things do not in and of themselves constitute sex addiction. So I think it would be up to your husband to want to find the answer to that question himself. And especially if you want the answer to that question, he should want to comply if that makes you feel safe and more willing to be in the relationship with him. Harold writes, I just received my 1-year sobriety chip this past weekend, and I'm doing well in recovery, so congratulations, Harold. What can my spouse, who I harmed with my addiction, do on her side of recovery? So I don't know what you're asking when you say that. Her side of recovery in relation to what? Just recovery or restoring sexuality between the two of you? But when we look at this process of sobriety, I don't know that partners are getting sober because partners are the betrayed parties in these situations and relationships and marriages. So their job is not about any kind of sobriety. Their job is really about healing and what they need for their healing. And oftentimes we have to understand 2 things. Number one, the partner's trauma has yet to really fully be understood and I think grokked by a lot of people because it's a silent kind of trauma. Many partners have no idea whatsoever that they were married to sex addicts, none. Whereas others, figured it out 15 years ago. They saw a lot of internet pornography. They were hoping it would go away, or there were telltale signs of affairs, but they were busy raising children and working. And nonetheless, along the way, they were probably in their own denial because of their circumstances, and then oftentimes the person doing the betraying engages in shoring up that denial by saying things like, it's not that big of a deal, or you're imagining things, and they're denying the partner's reality. But when the partner does learn of the sex addiction, the amount of trauma is egregious because they actually feel pinned. They cannot move. You know, when you're in a traumatic situation and somebody's accosting you, you can fight back. You can literally punch or hit or run or do any number of things to get out of the offending situation. But when a partner learns that he or she has been lied to for years on end and their reality has been distorted, they've been pinned in a way where they cannot move. There's no one to tell. There's no one to go to. There's really no one to hit or punch or attack other than the addict. And many times people don't do that. I'm not recommending that they do it, but they sit silently and frozen with this trauma, which makes the problem that much worse. And it looks like, you know, nothing has physically befallen them, but they have the same reactions because of this inability to move that energy. So each partner has to take responsibility ultimately for what they need for their own healing, whether it's therapy or a 12-step meeting or reaching out to friends and family or going to an intensive program. We have an intensive program here for 6 days for partner where we help partners move out of this frozen state. Then that's what they need to do. Paul writes, this business of a garment of shaming isn't as intense as what feels like a total body tattooing of shame that I feel. So that, is a very serious therapy problem when you talk about shame feeling like it's tattooed all over your body. This kind of toxicity is really important to unpack in therapy over time, and that description is so vivid and so much of a metaphor of how cloaked in shame you must feel that I would say that this is a long-term therapy proposition that's going to take time for you to heal that and come out from under that shame. And this is where working with body psychotherapy is extremely valid, or working with people who are psychoanalysts who also understand body trauma and even sex addiction, and we have some of those people, fortunately, in Los Angeles. So you want to make sure you're with the right therapist in order to deal with that kind of profound, pervasive shame. So Max writes, I believe I'm a victim of covert incest with my mother. My father was emotionally absent and thought she never overtly abused me, and I felt like I've taken care of her needs. I want to confront this abandonment and pain and move past it, but do you recommend any discussion or opening up to my parents about this abuse? Well, first, I think you have to make sure you really clearly understand this abuse, and if you haven't already read Ken Adams' work, he's written a book called When He's Married to Mom, where he talks about this mother enmeshment with men. Mother enmeshed men is what he calls it. And also a book called Silently Seduced, which is specifically about covert incest. I think you need to read both of those books, and you need to work with a therapist who understands this mother enmeshment with men also, and the effect it has on men's adequacy, their sense of sexuality, and their ability to move on and get involved with other women without feeling like they're betraying their mothers. So that's really the first order of business, and Dr. Adams has Mother Enmeshed Men workshops twice a year. I believe there's one coming up in September. I think it's the weekend of the 24th in Michigan. So if you're so inclined, if you're motivated, if you have the time and the money that you can take off for a weekend, I would highly recommend that you check that out because people report moving and shifting greatly from taking these workshops. They're led by him. It's all men, and it's specifically for men who have been emotionally incested by their mothers. So once you have done a good deal of work on this specific piece, I think then you'll have the answer to the question about how you talk to your parents about this, how you set boundaries with visiting them, talking to them, certainly boundaries around having any kind of conversations with your mother that are emotionally inappropriate, whereby she's talking to you about her, emotional issues that she should be talking to a therapist about, or she should be going to a 12-step meeting for. But that absolutely is not in any way, shape, or form your job or your responsibility. It wasn't as a child, and it is not as an adult. So, any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so all of us are aware of the toxic extremes of sex and love. We see it in the media all the time. We hear about it. We hear about sex crime, stalking, rape, emotional anorexia, heartbreak, and suicide. These are the many extremes that sex and love addiction can take. And this has been going on from the beginning of time, just like everything's been going on since the beginning of time. But, we hear about it so much because of the Internet and the rapidity with which information flows today. And human beings have always related to other human beings through this process of objectification, exploitation, and control. So we can recover from misinformation and unhealthy ways of feeling and behaving when we start to recognize that we are being victimized by so many different forces, and that it's our responsibility ultimately to try to come out from under that victimization. Obviously, if you are currently being sex trafficked by someone, you have no power whatsoever in that situation. It's very difficult to start to take responsibility for yourself. But when you come out of the toxicity, whatever the system is, whether it's an abusive household or being a sex slave or a sex worker, and you don't want to be there, or sex addict, or shame, then you start to have choices and you can start to take more responsibility for your sexual recovery. So let's talk about some of the ways in which you can start to take steps to recover your sexuality. And we can't really regain our sexual health or our sexuality unless we personally take steps to improve our conditions that start to imprint our brains and our bodies with healthy patterns. So the first order is to stop being around toxic people, stop being around people that shame us, stop being around people that make fun of our bodies, or that we're too fat or too thin or too young or too old, and stop listening to those messages that start to erode our sense of self, how we feel about our bodies, how we feel about our own kind of internal sensuality, and build that for ourselves. So first, there's a lot of, as I said, deconstruction and subtraction that has to take place. You've got to get rid of a whole bunch of people and things, and sometimes article of clothing also, that makes you feel less than good about yourself. And once you start doing that, you want to put yourself in the presence of people that are on a similar path. So it could be, as I said, a path of self-awareness through a spiritual group, whether it's a meditation group, a sangha, or a church group and community. It doesn't matter what the construct is. What matters is that you resonate with it, and that you're with people, healthy men and women, that are starting to help you imprint these healthier patterns on your brain and in your body. So I would encourage you to find, if you're male, to find a men's group where the topic of conversation is sex and sexuality. All of our male sex addiction groups here are, not just groups about just sex addiction. We talk a lot about sex and sexuality, and what's healthy and what's viable and what's real and what people want to learn about themselves. And likewise with our fit women's groups here too. Anything goes. There's no lack of conversation that can be had. For women, there are also groups you can find that are often geared towards the goddess or something sensual, and I would encourage you to do anything like that that helps you feel connected to your sexuality. Jill writes, my dad said to me when I was 8 or 9 years old that I was going to have a butt just like your mom. I knew he was out of place and wrong for saying that to me, but ended up being seriously bulimic, and I married a sex addict. I've wondered if my dad is a sex addict. I at least think that it was inappropriate for my dad to tell me that, especially so young. Do you agree? And I would say I absolutely agree with that, Jill, and I'm so sorry that you had to endure that. But that is precisely the type of comment that I'm talking about. That is so profoundly shaming to a young girl who's developing. She's being told by her father that her body's wrong. Not only is it wrong, but it's going to look like your mother's, who he may have talked to in disparaging ways, and it makes you feel like you're damaged or there's something wrong with you. And so, bulimia is a way of regaining control and certainly control over the body, and it's not uncommon for men who make these kind of comments about their daughters to be inappropriately sexualizing of women. So he crossed a boundary there that was way out of bounds for a child. And, I can't answer whether your father was or wasn't a sex addict, but you can put those pieces together, especially if you ended up marrying a sex addict. Typically, we do what we know, or we replicate what we know, even though we don't think we're doing it. Someone else writes, do your groups help people unpack the shaming from sexually repressive religion? And I would say yes. I mean, when you look for a group therapy, there should be a place to talk about spirituality, the repression of religion, the effects it has on sex and sexuality, what's okay sexually, what isn't. I've worked with a client who grew up in a very religious family, and so the things that he likes sexually, he automatically dumps into the sex addiction realm, or that he's not working his program correctly, and all of that is nonsense. It's just not true. Wanting to have oral sex with a woman does not make him, a sex addict or not working his program. His religion taught him that, and so his program is about not engaging in behaviors that are anonymous and shaming, getting into relationship with women so he can have the kind of sex he wants to have, whether it's oral sex or dressing in women's clothing or, engaging in BDSM practices that are appropriately monitored and agreed upon. Those are the points of sexual recovery we're talking about, as opposed to repression, shame, and degradation. The woman that's written back states that she worked as an erotic dancer for 6 years total when she was in her late 20s and early 30s, and that this felt like a way to celebrate my sexuality and pride in my body. It was my own choice. I didn't have anyone who encouraged me or pushed me into it. It does not feel like a damaging situation, but your mentioning of sex workers as generalized groups make me wonder if I was damaging in some way that I've denied. I don't feel like it is, but I could be mistaken. I felt it connected me to my sexuality in a healthy way, and I'm not in therapy for sex addiction or love addiction. I'm primarily working on emotional abuse from my mom. Can you offer some insight on this at all? Is it possible to work as an erotic dancer in a sexually and mentally healthy way, or am I just in denial? So, I don't know, to answer your question. I can understand that. What I would think about this, and I may be wrong since I don't know you, is that if your mother was emotionally abusive and she was denigrating of your body, one of the ways for you or a young person to reclaim that and to say, I'll show you, is to go use your body as a source of power, control, sensuality, so that you felt like you had dominion over it. Your mother didn't. And maybe you were putting yourself in an arena that was simultaneously degrading or humiliating if men were using you, to masturbate to, or using your image in some ways that might have had you feeling bad or dirty. And I don't think that you're saying that. But if that were the case, that's a case of sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face. And so maybe you became an erotic dancer for reasons that you thought were true for you, but maybe they were the wrong reasons, and I mean wrong in quotation marks. But only you can suss that out and discover what is true for you. It may have been a harmless practice for you. It might not have hurt you in any way, but the emotional abuse from your mother was somehow tied into that decision to dance, is what I would think. And so I think that is a small kernel that's worth investigating in your therapy. How big of a piece was that? How much did it send you to do that? And were you doing it for the right reasons for you ultimately? Where was power and control embedded in that for you? And how do you have that power and control today without being a dancer? And where does power and control over men fit into that picture also? So these are just questions that I would think about. So if you had when you say you had the option of speaking to your clients for a long time before you danced for them, but that you were able to screen your clients, then that's lucky. A lot of dancers don't have that luxury, especially when they work in clubs. They're required to do and meet quotas and do what they're told to do. So if you feel like that it was a clean, emotionally clean experience for you, then it likely was. I don't think it's worth looking for trouble when there's no trouble. We all have enough trouble as it is when it comes to the abuse that we suffered. There's no need to go manufacture it. So if dancing was a liberated act for you, if it made you feel good, if you felt like you did it in a way that wasn't shaming for you, then that's your truth. Somebody's writing in, Michael, saying, I'm still having a hard time having sex with my partner after being sober over a year. It's not as often as she would like. Am I just not that comfortable with initiating? Any tips? So I would have to know what exactly you're talking about. When you say that you're still having a hard time, because you're not comfortable initiating, I'm curious about what's uncomfortable about the initiation. What happens to you internally? What are you noticing in your body? And I think those are investigatory questions for you yourself, and also would be helpful to talk about probably in a couples therapy setting for you, with your partner there, because there's a dynamic that's taking place between the two of you that's always the case. So shame might be creeping in, a sense that you're not deserving of her in some ways. You may have performance anxiety, but something's going on that you might want to investigate more deeply about what it is about initiation that you struggle with. So if we go back to looking at setting these healthy patterns for ourselves, I would suggest that you make a list of what's stopping you from experiencing your sexual, emotional, and relational prime. Do you have blocks, a lack of opportunity, or other challenges? So in the case of this person writing in, you might want to look at, what blocks you from initiating? What stops you from wanting to want your partner? Are you busy in her head? Are you trying to figure out what you think she wants or needs or likes without talking to her directly or explicitly about it? How focused are you on your own sexual pleasure and desire? And do you feel a right to your own sexual pleasure, or are you too busy tracking your partner to know what's really true for you and what you want? So these are some questions to ask yourself about your blocks and your limitations. Research every obstacle to sexual health on your list. Be relentless about that research. How do people recover from similar problems? Take a look at books, schedule consultations, sign up for workshops. Do things that you need to do in order to really start to break through those barriers for yourself. Someone on the phone asks if I can discuss more about how to navigate when a partner and addict have different ideas of what their true sexual identity is. For example, one of the partners says their sexual desire does not include anal sex, and the other partner views this act as part of their sexual ideal. How do you help a couple committed maintain sexual health without pressuring each other to conform? Okay, so this happens all the time where people have different levels of desire, different preferences for sexual acts. And these can be incredibly challenging and painful conversations because they force us to look at ourselves, to really look at our own sexual limitations. So the partner who is saying that their ideal sex does not include anal sex, and the other person says that ideally anal sex is a part of the relationship, means that both parties have to talk in great detail with each other about what they do and don't like about that particular sexual act. And what comes up for a lot of people immediately is shame. It's shameful to talk about it. It's shameful to talk about the anus. It's shameful to talk about it as a place that is dirty or wrong or highly pleasurable and arousing. It's one of those taboo areas in our culture that we don't talk about, and we certainly don't get sex education about anal sex because we barely get sex education about sex at all. So it's not something that you're learning as a teenager as you're growing up, but you are seeing it in pornography and you're hearing about it all the time today. So I would invite both of you to get very, very granular about what it is you like about that act and what you don't like about it. And that means you're going to have to do some writing, and you're going to have to sit opposite each other and talk to each other in detail, and it might bring up anger, it might bring up tears, it might bring up shame, but what it will do is it will create an intimate conversation between the two of you. And both of you are going to have to move in closer to each other to bridge that gap. So the person who says, I'm never going to engage in anal sex, has to, at the very least, talk about it in detail about the why. And the person who says, I have to have anal sex, also has to talk about it in detail and maybe has to kind of close their window of how often they want to have it, whereas the other person has to open their window to the conversation and to start to possibly experience where their blocks are to it and why. I want to say that Neil Cannon, who is one of the, I would say, premier sex therapists in the country, is going to present on our next guest webinar series on mismatched libidos, and that's going to be on October 9th. That's free. Dr. Cannon is located in Colorado, for those of you who might be fortunate enough to live close by. And so he can address that topic in much more detail, given that we only have a few minutes left here on this webinar. So the key to all of these questions is conversation. Conversation precedes sex in ways that, we're never really taught about. So the surest path to the full recovery of your sexual health starts with this first step, with the step of conversation, and to remind yourself that sexual health and healthy sexuality are lifelong processes. It's not something we attain. It's something that we're constantly looking at, seeking, trying to better, trying to examine, deconstruct. Things that we used to like, maybe we don't like anymore. Maybe it's because it's hard on our bodies. Things that we never thought we like, we begin to like because we're willing to challenge what our ideas, our thoughts, the mores and messages that we got were not really true for us along the way. So consider that an adult sexuality means that you're redefining your sexuality every single decade of your life, and as you get older, probably every year or at least every 5 years. So just like you clean out your wardrobe and you get rid of clothes you don't wear anymore, you should be cleaning out your sexual repertoire as well and looking at what works, what doesn't, what you like, what you don't, and most of all, sharing that with your partner once you get honest with yourself. So I hope that you take time today to restore your sexual health. That's what we stand for here at Center for Healthy Sex. I want to remind you that you can talk to any intake counselor anytime at 310-843-9902, and that if you have any questions, you can always feel free to text them or write them in during these monthly webinars. So I look forward to seeing you in October. I hope you have a healthy, sexy rest of September and that you take good care. And I'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.